All right, we're live, so I'm going to hand it over to you, Devin. Thanks again, everyone.
Hello, I want to welcome all of you who are tuned in to Real Talk, Voicing the Margins. This month's this conversation will be about the Indigenous National Day of Mourning. I want to apologize for being a disembodied voice. I'm having some technical issues with my computer, but we have some panelists here who are much better to look at than myself anyway, and so we are going to get right into it. I'm going to start off by introducing Real Talk to you who are not familiar with it, and then we will jump right into the conversation after we've introduced our panelists and our topic. All right. Real Talk Voicing the Margins is a series of curated live conversations on issues and topics of critical import to marginalized communities, including but not limited to people of color, LGBTQIA+, and economically disadvantaged citizens. Providing a voice and a platform for often voiceless people is at the heart of the series. Real Talk Voicing the Margins is a partnership with the Woody Guthrie Center, the Tulsa Artists Fellowship, Folk Alliance International, Black Wall Street Times, and Tri-City Collective. During the pandemic, our Real Talk series is platformed on Facebook Live, and in time, we will return to live audiences at the Woody Guthrie Center. At this time, we would like to share Woody Guthrie's land acknowledgement. In the centennial year of the Tulsa Race Massacre, the Woody Guthrie Center acknowledges the land on which we gather is home of the Osage, Cherokee, and Muskogee Creek nations, as well as being the ancestral home of the Caddo and numerous other tribes before the forced removal. Their honor and blood inform our spirit and our work. We also acknowledge the Black Americans who lost life, property, and generational wealth in the 1921 massacre. Their honor and blood inform our spirit and our work. I'm going to introduce our panelists now. So first up, we have Nikki Michael, PhD. Nikki K. Michael, PhD, is the chair and associate professor of American Indian Studies at Bacone College in Muskogee. She has served as an Indigenous Studies professor at Bemidji State University of Wyoming, and Rogers State University. Currently, she is serving in her 10th year of elected leadership roles with her nation, the Delaware Tribe of Indians. Dr. Michael is a mother to 5 teenage boys and is also an avid reader. She spends most of her summers in ceremonies with her family and relatives. Next up, we have Dr. Patrick Funicello. Dr. Funicello is an assistant professor of history at Tarleton State University. He teaches the following courses: Latin America after independence, history of Mexico, the rise and fall of Iberian empires, authoritarianism since 1919, World Civilizations 1 and 2, and U.S. History 1. In his free time, he enjoys getting into trouble with his kids and activities that start with the letter B, such as baseball, brewing beer, baking bread, and bicycling. We have a representative from United American Indians of New England, or UAIN for short. UAIN is a native-led organization. And our representative is Matoi. UAIN is a native-led organization of Native people and our supporters who fight back against racism and for the freedom of Leonard Peltier and other political prisoners. We support Indigenous struggles. Sorry about that. I just lost my place somehow. We support Indigenous struggles, not only in New England, but throughout the Americas. We fight back on such issues as racism, of the Pilgrim mythology perpetuated in Plymouth, and in the U.S. government's assault on poor people. We protest the use of racist team names and mascots in sports. We speak to classes in schools and universities about current issues in Native struggle. Indigenous people from North Central or South America who live in New England and who agree with what we are trying to do are welcome to join us. We also welcome the support of non-Native people from the four directions. We believe very strongly that we must support others in struggle, particularly other communities of color, the LGBTQ community, and the disabled community. And then last but not least, we're going to read actually what our Real Talk is about. Succulent golden brown turkey stuffed to capacity with grandma's famous dressing. How does she make it so good? It's a secret recipe, and despite your possession of the beige index card with all the ingredients and the entire cooking process written down, you still fail to replicate it perfectly. All the tender vittles are present: ham, green beans, cranberry sauce, pumpkin, or sweet potato pie, if you're down with the culture. The most distinguished guests, of course, are your mother, father, cousins, grandparents, and your sister's new baby who's experiencing their first Thanksgiving. Before your family prepares to besiege the annual bountiful feast, you all bow your heads and thank 4 centuries of physical and cultural genocide of the indigenous people in America. Thanksgiving is more than a holiday. It's an American tradition observed by tens of millions of Americans every year. To many indigenous people, this celebration is more akin to celebrating imperialism, colonialism, and the eradication of millions of indigenous people. Beginning in New England in 1970, many Native people opted out of celebrating Thanksgiving and began commemorating the National Day of Mourning. The knowledge that every square inch of this vast country was stolen through lies, broken treaties, manipulation, and brutal violence is becoming more prevalent. More and more Americans are withdrawing from traditional Thanksgiving celebration and establishing new traditions. And with that, I want to open up my first question to Matoi. And I really just want to ask, can you tell us how the National Day of Indigenous Mourning got started?
Sure, I'd love to speak about that. First of all, I wanted to thank you for inviting me and say that I, in particular, wanted to speak to you there in that region, because not only are you on the stolen land of so many different tribal nations, but you also have a community there that's done just the most amazing work to keep the history of the 1921 massacre alive. And that is so important to all of us, I think, that has happened. And that's the kind of work that we seek to do also, is to correct history and to tell the truth about history so that others will know about that. So we have had National Day of Mourning in Plymouth, Massachusetts every year since 1970. We think it's the longest running demonstration in the country, actually, because we keep going back and doing it every year. And our participants in National Day of Mourning honor Native ancestors and also the struggles of Native peoples to survive today. It's not just focusing on the past. And when we're there, we tell the truth about the history of the European invasion, as well as have Indigenous speakers from many contemporary struggles. In addition, we also express our solidarity with other struggles, such as the movement for Black lives, because we believe as Indigenous people that our liberation is intertwined with the liberation of our Black family and other relatives. So I want to start off by, I know that some people listening to this may wonder what we have against Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving seems good. You have a big meal, maybe you watch football, you hang out with grandma, you know, all those things are really good. So I want to explain that as Indigenous people, we actually give thanks every day. We're not against giving thanks. The way we're brought up is to give thanks all the time. So that is very important to us. But when we're talking about the Thanksgiving myth in this country, the mythology that the United States has constructed around the Pilgrims, we're absolutely not going to give thanks for the arrival of the Pilgrims and all the others who came after and stole Indigenous land, forced Indigenous people to abandon their own spiritualities and cultures, and engaged in violent violence against all our peoples, causing our physical genocide as well as our cultural and other genocides. And that genocide is not something that happened in 1620 or in a particular year. That genocide is still happening now. So I know that what I'm going to say may be upsetting to a few people who have not really thought about Thanksgiving and what it means, but I want you to just sit back and try to listen, and just try to listen to the words without feeling angry about it, if you can do that. I know a lot of times non-Native people get upset that they were lied to in school about history. They may be upset that they were lied to about Columbus discovering America, when of course that didn't happen. Columbus did not discover America, he invaded it. And I know as well that people sometimes react, non-Native people can sometimes react to the idea that what we were taught about Thanksgiving is not true. So let me just say what the myth is, which is they said in school that the Pilgrims were seeking religious freedom and landed on Plymouth Rock. They said the Indians welcomed them with open arms. Then the Pilgrims and Indians sat down to a harvest meal with turkey and stuffing and cranberry sauce. And then the Indians sort of faded into the background somewhere. And everyone lived happily ever after, the end. So everything about that is a lie that's intentionally designed to hide our genocide. First, the Pilgrims are glorified and mythologized because the circumstances of the first permanent English colony in North America, which was Jamestown, were too ugly to hold up as a national myth. At Jamestown, the settlers resorted to cannibalism in addition to bringing in Black slaves. And no school really wants to teach little kids about settler cannibalism. So I think for them, they found that Pilgrims and Indians getting along seemed to be a much more marketable story. But second, the Pilgrims came here as part of a commercial venture. They did not need religious freedom. They already had that back in the Netherlands. The Mayflower Compact that they signed was a group of white men who wanted to ensure that they would get a return on their investment. And they also were lost when they arrived at Cape Cod. The Pilgrims never landed on Plymouth Rock. In fact, they did not even first land at Plymouth. Plymouth Rock was just the rock that Plymouth town officials dragged down to the waterfront decades later, and they constructed a sort of edifice around it and a national mythology around it. And before 1620, a lot of people think that nobody came, none of the Europeans came to New England before the Pilgrims came in 1620. But in fact, there were already Europeans and ships along the coast there. And the indigenous population had already been decimated in this region here in so-called New England from a great dying that happened around 1616. And that was caused by the European diseases that were spread by ships that arrived previously. Crews on those ships also kidnapped indigenous people as slaves. So an apocalypse of sorts had already happened before the Pilgrims and then the Puritans and the other English arrived. One of the very first things that the Pilgrims did when they arrived on Cape Cod before they came to Plymouth was to rob Wampanoag graves and steal as much of the native people's winter provisions of corn and beans as they were able to carry. It is true that some Wampanoag people did welcome the Pilgrims and did save them from starvation. These were people who had themselves been around the English and had in fact, one of them had been kidnapped himself and gone to England, and that's why he spoke English. And what Wampanoag and other people in the region got for this kindness was genocide, the theft of lands, slavery, starvation, and never-ending repression. The Pilgrims were not peaceful. They also engaged in armed actions against indigenous people in the area, including against the Massachusetts and Pequot, and they tried to enforce their own values and beliefs on others. This next part is going to be really shocking to some of you. The first official Thanksgiving did not take place in 1621, when the Pilgrims had a harvest time meal that was provided largely by the Wampanoag. Instead, The first Thanksgiving was officially proclaimed by the Puritan governor Winthrop in 1637 to celebrate the massacre of over 700 Pequot, men, women, and children on the banks of the Mystic River in Connecticut. After that, massacres of the native population were routinely followed by days of Thanksgiving. Native women and children over 14 were sold into slavery, while many more were murdered just for resisting. Boats loaded with as many as 500 slaves regularly left the ports of New England, and bounties were paid for Indian scalps to encourage as many deaths as possible. So to non-native people, Thanksgiving may seem like a fun holiday where they can get together with family and eat turkey. But why would we be thankful for the arrival of invaders from England? Should we give thanks for the fact that unemployment rates surpass 50% on many reservations, or that our life expectancies are much lower than white Americans? Should we give thanks that our infant mortality and teen suicide rates are much higher than those of white Americans? Every single one of the more than 350 treaties has been broken by the US government. Should we give thanks for the pipelines running through our territories and damaging our water? Are we to give thanks for being treated as unwelcome on our own lands? So National Day of Mourning started in 1970 when an Aquinnah Wampanoag man named Wamsutta Frank James decided to speak up about the true history behind Thanksgiving. He was asked to speak at a state dinner celebrating the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrim Landing. The planners asked to see his speech in advance, and it turned out that his views that were based on history, in fact, based on the Pilgrims' own accounts, were not what the descendants of the Pilgrims wanted to hear. The planners wanted to rewrite his speech so that he would be praising the Pilgrims, but Wamsutta Frank James would not be silenced. So on Thanksgiving Day in 1970, he and a couple hundred supporters gathered at Coles Hill in Plymouth to observe the first National Day of Mourning. So that is the beginning of it. And we wanted to let you know, everybody who's listening to this, that we now live stream National Day of Mourning as well. So if you want to join us through the miracle of all this technology, you are welcome to join us on November 25th, this coming Thursday. We start with a spiritual ceremony at 12 noon that is not filmed, but then we have speeches and marches, and you will learn a lot if you come and listen. So we warmly welcome anybody who's listening to this to come and join us through the live stream. Thank you.
Thank you, Matoi. We really do appreciate you being here. Having the people who actually started this in our present is really, really an honor. And I wanted to just kind of jump off from what you just said. And I want to ask just a couple of questions from Dr. Patrick and Dr. Nikki. And I really want to start about academia, because when we talk about these things, people say, oh, well, this is much too harsh for the children. How we can't tell them these things. That's why we're not telling them. So when it comes to presenting a decolonized deconstruction of the origins of Thanksgiving, where do we start?
I don't know if you want me to chime in. To answer that general question, I sort of have a chip on my shoulder about any of the idea that my students are arriving with some sort of sanitized version of these things. I generally start my class the first day and explain to them, if I don't make them uncomfortable a few times in class, they're wasting their time, I'm wasting my time, they're wasting their money. They're there to be made a little bit uncomfortable. And I try to sort of explain to them that those were the moments that stuck with me when I was in their seat, as an undergrad, is when I was made to squirm a bit because some mythology that I'd swallowed whole and took to heart was picked apart and not true. So in a general sense, I mean, that's what I try to do as a professor.
Well, with my students, we tend to look at the lives of Indigenous folks previous to the European invasion, and that helps to give a perspective and also deconstruct if there are preconceptions, if they've already had those thought processes already in their brains. So that helps to also set the stage for when the European invasion does happen. Then we look at, and we also examine European societies at the same time of Indigenous societies, so that sets their mind and sets the stage for the violence that occurs, because European societies were built on conquest. They were built on Christianizing. And so that really clashes, of course, when they do arrive in the North American continent. We also call it Turtle Island. And that also brings to light why there's so much violence, because I think that's the shocking part of all of this. And it should be shocking, right? And should we shelter these kids, especially 4 or 5 years old, from the truth? And I ask my students that all the time. And I not only am teaching college students, but I've been called on to train the teachers in a lot of different settings. In fact, we're working with at least 150 teachers in New York right now, and they range from teachers of all ages, from kindergarten to high school, and they ask that same question. But, we want to know if the students are capable of handling this. Well, by the time they get to college and feel lied to all their lives, then they're pretty peeved. I'll just put it that way, as long as they're open to it. Now, some of them, oh my goodness, you get really reticent attitudes about, because this is what they base their whole identity on, right? They're American, and America tells us that this is how it happened. And all of a sudden you're pulling that carpet out from underneath them. And that is actually even more disturbing, I think, to a lot of our non-Native folks than just having been exposed to the truth, and that truth would probably get us much further along in the long run than, having lied to them. And I never lied to my kids. They got the truth of it from the time they were babies all the way up to where they're at today. And I'm much happier with their ability to think and process issues rather than having fed them the lies all the way up to their 18 years of 18 and think that that's the story, because that is more damaging than the truth.
Devin, I would add to that as well, as a mom, that it's really what informs my work and the work of a lot of Indigenous people. We do tell the truth to our children, and we tell it to them in an age-appropriate manner. That is, when I was talking to 4-year-olds about Columbus, I didn't talk to them about sexual trafficking of 9-year-olds, because they wouldn't understand that. It's not an appropriate thing to talk to them about. But they understood in a very fundamental way that Columbus and his men were bad, and that they killed a lot of Native people, that they invaded the land of Native people. And I showed them where on a map, and we talked about who the people were, and that they were bad men who killed people. And any 4-year-old can understand that, no sweat. And when we're talking about Thanksgiving, I would say the same thing. Again, be age appropriate, but you can say, some people tell the story, and sometimes we even talk about this because schools are continuing to do these ridiculous pageants where the kids dress up like pilgrims and Indians and all that. And so it's a story, and the story is that this is the story that they tell, and we can tell our kids starting very young that it's not true that the Pilgrims were as nice as they say. And it's not true that the Native people lived happily ever after. And a lot of bad things happened to the Native people as a result of the Pilgrims and the others coming there. And again, even very young children can understand this. It's really important, I think, for younger children to understand that they need to like think about historical reality and what that means from different perspectives, not just looking at it from a settler perspective, which is what they're taught in school.
Can I chime in?
Of course, yes.
So specifically on Columbus, I mean, Columbus is to me the lowest of low-hanging fruits when you want to talk about reconsidering what has been taught and what the facts on the ground are. And the reason why I say that is you don't even have to dig that deep. You can just look at the documentation itself to find out how his contemporaries thought of him. And I always like to sort of bring up the example of, Queen Isabella, who is no progressive thinker by any means. She establishes the Inquisition. She couldn't stand him because she felt like what he did, he went too far, even in her eyes. She's quoted in letters as saying, basically stop, giving away my subjects, and in the classic but regalist sense. Francisco Bobadilla is sent to investigate Columbus and brings him famously back to Spain in chains. The chains are taken off when he gets to Spain, but it's not that hard to sort of pierce this myth, even with the documentation of the invaders themselves. He's not in good stead with his contemporaries. So, the absurdity then of finding out that he's awarded a holiday in a place where he never stepped foot on, for people from a country who've always sort of had this anti-papist, anti-Catholic hatred, to award this holiday. It's absurdity upon absurdity upon absurdity. So when I'm broaching this subject, it's really quite easy to sort of lay out the facts. And again, if students are resistant to that in the first place, if they feel like their identities are bound up in this myth, there's not much you can do. But I would say that in recent years, I found more and more students at least prepared to sort of examine that when they come to my classrooms. I am not an optimist by any means, but this is one area where I see them at least receptive to re-examining some of these myths.
So just speaking about Columbus, why do you think there's been such an effort to really canonize him as a hero in this country?
I mean, I don't know if I should chime in. I think I'm also the token Italian American, and I'm really disloyal to my hyphenated ethnicity. But I would say that it just was an effort to not have a British, name attached to as sort of the patron saint of conquest or whatever, to avoid that. I just find it very odd that in an anti-Catholic and for a long time anti-Italian Italian American country, that Columbus would get his name drawn out of a hat. It's absurd as well because he's Genoese. There's no Italy at the time, and Southern Italians, the ones who came to the United States, did not think much of him. So I don't know. I mean, I just think we're kind of a silly country at times, and this became the mythology. I don't know beyond that.
Can I chime in real quick too? I think it's the same regardless of whether it's Columbus, Thanksgiving, or in Oklahoma, the Boomer Sooners, right? Like, regardless of which heroism or regardless of which, the American folklore is attaching itself to, they all come from the same family. They're all extremely violent and are predicated on the erasure of Indigenous peoples. And when I say erasure, that's not in a positive sense. It's the erasure both in violent and coercive and also in maybe subliminal ways that, we can rewrite this history, and then we send it out there and people believe it rather than actually facing it head on in a way that says, do we want to keep repeating it? And I think each of these examples shows that we keep repeating it, right? And then every time we might make some ground, it's going to be a backlash against it. And it's even stronger than the numbers of us who can speak out and say, hey, here's what the actual documents say. All right.
Having worked on Indigenous Peoples Day campaigns all over the place, you know, I can tell you, at least here in the Northeast, in some areas, the biggest issue we have is right-wing organizations such as Sons of Italy and Knights of Columbus. Even when we come into meetings and hearings with documentation and, you know, lots of contemporary information, contemporary to Columbus information about what happened, they will continue to deny that. They call us cannibals and savages. They say that we should be grateful that Columbus brought civilization and Christianity to us and all that kind of thing. So it's very much a, you know, here in the region, we actually asked some Italian friends to start an organization called Italians for Indigenous Peoples Day, so that they could work with us to push this back, because a lot of times these right-wing organizations claim to be speaking for all Italians, and it's just not true. You know, there are plenty of progressive Italian Americans around, so you know, they come and help us out a lot of these hearings to push back against that. And that's been really important to us, to have those kind of allies when we're going in. It's unfortunate that there are people who they are just going to defend Columbus to the death, you know, they will not let go of him. But, you know, I think we speak truth to power always, and you know, anywhere in the country where any of us are doing Indigenous Peoples Day work. And I think what we have to say is certainly very compelling and changes a lot of people's minds sometimes too.
And speaking of your efforts in Massachusetts, how is Thanksgiving observed in Plymouth, Mass today? Because with it being the epicenter of really this fight over the past, you know, 50 odd years, how is it celebrated, or how is it observed? What is the climate like?
Plymouth is certainly an epicenter of something. That's right. So, but if I can explain, Plymouth, so down at the waterfront in the major tourist area of Plymouth, there's this Plymouth Rock, which is not a real rock. And in fact, in the 20th century, they carved 1620 into it, which is kind of hilarious, because it's not as though the Pilgrims like fell off the boat into the harbor and immediately started carving 1620 into anything, not to mention they didn't actually land there. So I think a lot of times Plymouth has a big tourist industry. It's actually very important to them. So upholding the Pilgrim mythology has been very important to them all along as well. Today there was, I think, it might have been the second largest Thanksgiving Day parade in the country after the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade. And they have that in Plymouth. And it's disgusting. For instance, they have things like, they say, oh, see colonists and Miles Standish men and Indians come to life, you know, from the history books out of, you know, before your very eyes, as though Indigenous people like aren't alive and live in history books, and we have to come alive as some kind of reenactors or something like that. So they've been largely continuing to be pretty attached to their mythology. At the same time, they're admitting that, you know, there should be some Indigenous involvement with some things, that kind of thing. Our organization does not participate or collaborate with that, because we believe that we can tell our own story without being within a framework of pilgrims and a Thanksgiving. You know, we have a lot to say without being within that framework and being constrained by that. So they're very big on, I mean, there's like thousands of tourists down there right now as I'm speaking. So we go there and do what we do. And, you know, we have not only Native people there, but a lot of non-Native people who come and stand with us and march with us and want to listen to what Indigenous people say. We only have Indigenous people speaking on National Day of Mourning. Our elders taught us that, you know, white people speak for us and over us every single other day of the year. So there needs to be at least one day where people are just listening to us. And we have followed that very closely over the years. So what we do there is very important. When it's not COVID, we have more than 1,000 people there every year. And I can tell you, I know, you're in Tulsa, but the weather is often not terribly nice in Massachusetts in late November. And we've been there in blizzards and horrible storms and in sub-zero, freezing temperatures and stuff like that. But we're there no matter what.
So speaking of Indigenous voices, for those curious about really reframing this holiday, who are some voices that they should start listening to, beyond today or during the Indigenous Day of Mourning? Who are some places who are some people, where are some organizations that they should point their attention to educate themselves? And that's for anybody.
Well, I think people should start with Nick Estes. So Nick Estes is a great writer. I think people should start with reading some actual history written by Indigenous people about this country. And there's some really great histories out now. And I think people need to do some reading and listening. There's a lot of great videos online and things like that. But I think I think it's really important to look at it from an Indigenous perspective. I think if you're a big fan of fiction, as I am, there are so many great Indigenous fiction writers writing about contemporary Indigenous experiences, as well as writing about more historic things. So, there's so many authors I could recommend. There are many children's books out now that are so good, written by Indigenous authors. And, when I say Nick Estes, he's written this, he wrote a great book called Our History is the Future. And I really recommend that people read it. It gives you a lot to think about. It sets a lot of history that you might think on its head, and it really explains not only about the absolutely critical role of Indigenous people as water protectors and land defenders, but why Indigenous voices and perspectives must be centered, and it completely centered, in order to even hope to begin to address the climate collapse that we're all experiencing.
I do like Nick Estes a lot as well. He does do the research from the ground level. And when I say that, it's really good to see Native folks that are actually still engaging, where sometimes when you get to the academic world, that kind of cuts people off in a way that, well, they're over there in academia and we're over here. And so I would encourage folks to actually, go to the tribes that are there. Our tribe, Lenape, we have 2 nations here in Oklahoma as a result of being removed out of the northeast part of the country. Our forced removals numbered no less than 6. And some of the tribe ended up having 8 removals by the time we got to Oklahoma. And that is no different, honestly, than most of the tribes here in Oklahoma. The 5, what they used to call civilized tribes, are now, they rather prefer the 5 tribes nomenclature. We had one huge removal, but it was, of course, just as devastating as any of the rest of ours. So by the time we get to Oklahoma, the 3 original nations, the Caddo, the Wichita, and the Osage, also have to make room for the tribes to come here. So it's a long, tedious, horrible history of getting here, finally get here, kind of reestablish ourselves. We know those histories. Those are not too long ago, grandparents, not in a distant sense. When people say, oh, that was a long time ago. It happened not too long ago. In fact, they just found a number of unmarked graves in Nebraska of those Indigenous kids that were forcefully taken from their parents, put in those boarding schools to Christianize and civilize them. Instead, those babies often died from starvation. That was one thing that they said. The other thing that they said that they found was that they had been drowned or that there were gunshot wounds. You know, we're talking anywhere from 4 to 18 years old. You know, again, not distant memory. We're talking about several generations back, but within, you know, our lifetime. So if people reached out to our tribes here, they would find some very open and honest dialogue about how we got here. And we are like influencing Oklahoma politics in a way that most people are not used to understanding. So that's where I would go through it. And I know Jacqueline Keeler is also another author I would recommend, but she's also very open and very accessible on Twitter and some of the other social networking sites. Indian Collective and land back organizations are working diligently to try to get some land back to the tribes. In fact, they're working on trying to get some Lenape lands back in New York and New Jersey. So those are some of my recommended, you know, who to talk to. You know, I'm sure Patrick might have some more.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, coming at this from the outside, what my sort of gateway, I always say gateway drug, that's just kind of the phrase I use, into some of these topics was, I mean, and I'm thinking back to when I was a student because I'm trying to help them and facilitate their experience, was being introduced to Leslie Marmon Silko's ceremony. I remember that kind of blowing my mind. James Welch at Fool's Crow. In my Latin American history classes, I try to sort of work in Rigoberto Menchu's, you know, sort of account of the genocide in Guatemala. You know, I work with, my students don't read, so I just try to do the best I can to sort of, you know, present things in snippets and at least get them sort of, you know, interested in these topics. But your point about how this isn't the past is a foreign country type of stuff. This is living history. This is things where we're still discovering things, and it's real, you know. And so this isn't, you know, this isn't my World Civ first half where it's, you know, I tell them you don't have to carry baggage for any. I'm like, this is real stuff. This is happening today. So, but those were, you know, my the books that sort of drew me in first.
And it's funny that you described it as a gateway drug, because once you start learning about this, you just can't stop. It starts as just one thing, you read a little more, you watch a video, so forth and so on. So, you know, learning is the first step. But for people who want to be allies, what should they do? What should non-Indigenous people do to be good allies, not just to raise awareness or make a culture? What should they do?
Indigenous folks have voices. So if they want to be good allies, to highlight the Indigenous voice as the voice, rather than going in, which often happens when there's kind of the hierarchy of who gets to speak. And when that privilege enters, and Indigenous folks do it as well, we kind of defer at that moment to the possibly male kind of white-looking voice. And so we need to be aware of that. And as someone who can also pass for white, I have to be aware of that, right? Like when there's a Native female that really needs to say something, and if I'm speaking over her, then her voice isn't going to be heard. So to me, that is critical when it comes to being a good ally, is making sure that those Indigenous voices are at the front. And one other thing I would say is that those folks that are out there on the front lines, if sometimes those allies would form that barrier, they're not going to get the kind of sentences or the kind of police brutality as our Indigenous folks get. And so when they serve in that barrier and they're saying, you're not going to do that to my brother or sister behind me, it really speaks volumes, and it creates a much better bond than trying to overstep and hiding those voices that really should be highlighted.
You heard it here first, folks. Amplify Indigenous voices. Use whatever privileges you have to make sure that happens, and make sure that you protect Indigenous people, especially if you're on the front line. Okay, my next question is, and sorry, you guys are such amazing speakers. You've answered so many of my questions that I was going to ask. But speaking of Oklahoma, can we talk a little bit about, Afro-Indigenous people? I know we don't have any representatives here, but as a Black man, I'm a diaspora. I'm not Indigenous, but there is an intersection, and this fight is as much mine as it is yours, I feel sometimes. So, what is the relationship between Afro-Indigenous people in this state, and what role do they serve in all of this?
Well, just remember, Oklahoma was a Confederate state, and it is a very contentious and ugly history we have here of some of the tribes actually bringing their slaves on the Trail of Tears to Indian territory. There is no getting away from that fact. Now, did all of the 5 tribes have, did each member? No. It was actually those who acculturated more. And sometimes people say it tended to be those who were mixed blood that had slaves. However, the thing is, there's no self-determining fact. We can judge all of the tribes with those peoples who had slavery. They were trying to fit in with American society. However, once the Civil War takes place, most of those tribes are split, to be honest. There are Cherokees who left Oklahoma and went up to Kansas and fought with the Union. And so those tribes amongst themselves are fighting of whether to have slavery in the future. And when the Confederate situation lost, in the end, they were also punished by the United States government, having fought for the Confederates, but they were required in their treaties, those treaties post-Civil War, to provide for the freedmen. Let's also kind of skip ahead about 30 years when they do the Dawson Allotment Act. And that is when they start doing all the rolls. The rolls would put the blood quantum of the individual Indians that they found, and they would base it off a lot of subjective kind of criteria, what they look like, what their parentage was. But it wasn't this objective, well, we've done this investigating, so we know you're a quarter. Okay, add this to the fact that when Indigenous folks were a quarter or more Indian blood, they were found to be incompetent to handle their own monies, their own land, and their kids would be taken away from them. So the impetus was to, claim less Indian blood. Alternatively, if there was a 1 drop of African-American blood, even if it's mixed with Indigenous here in Oklahoma, they were considered Black. And those are the folks right now that are still trying to get their rights as freedmen. And so that's the sticking point. But from the Indigenous perspective, their argument is, well, they don't have Indian blood. Some of them did, some of them didn't. And we don't know. We'll never we have to go back in time, and that's pretty impossible to do. So from both sides, they have some strong arguments, but from, of course, the freedmen side, like we didn't have a choice. We were brought here, and we, integrated as much of the Indigenous perspective and worldview and participated in the cultures just as much as the rest of the tribe. And so it can get pretty dicey. And you can see perspectives from both sides, and I can't speak for both sides because my tribe didn't have slaves. We fought for the Union. But from what I understand, those are the arguments that are most, put out there, and there's no easy answer.
Many of the Indigenous people who are in Massachusetts and Rhode Island in this region, especially along the East Coast, going into some other areas. Many are Afro-Indigenous, and many were, it took a long time for many of them to get federal recognition of their tribal nations because they had many members who were Afro-Indigenous, because the federal government, as well as the state governments, would often consider them Black rather than Afro-Indigenous. Somehow the federal government and the states couldn't hold in their brains that people could be both. So here in Massachusetts, for instance, 2 of the historic tribes are federally recognized: the Aquinnah tribe of Wampanoag, the Wampanoag tribe of Aquinnah, or Gayhead, and also the Mashpee Wampanoag. There are several other historic tribes that are not federally recognized, for instance. And I think our organization feels very strongly that the rights of Black freedmen need to be restored. We understand that these are internal issues being dealt with by sovereign nations, other sovereign nations. We have been very glad to see that the Cherokee Nation has been stepping up on this, because that's really important. And we hope that everyone else will do so as well, because there were promises made about that, and those promises need to be kept. And the freedmen are, in our view, right to continue to agitate for the citizenship that they should have. The other thing I wanted to say, though, since unlike Patrick's students, I actually do like to read a lot, is that there is a brand new book out that I'd really like to recommend to people, written by a fellow named Kyle Mays, M-A-Y-S, called An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States. And it's just come out. And I would really recommend that to people. Our ties, the ties between Black and Indigenous communities go back so far, for centuries. And the history is amazing and it's inspiring. I've certainly been inspired by what happened at the PD River. For instance, in the 1500s, when Indigenous people and enslaved Black people got together and kicked the Spaniards out, and just went off to live together and live their own lives without enslavement and without European encroachment. The Seminole Wars are so inspiring, and there's something that a lot of people don't know that much about. And there's so many beautiful examples of Black and Indigenous unity and joint struggle over the years. And I think everybody should learn about that. I think that's a key part of history that everybody should know about and celebrate.
This is well, it's not really a digression at all. I find this topic utterly fascinating in Mexican context because of the casta system. And if you want an easy way to demonstrate the social construction of race, just show the casta painting, postcards, cards that proliferated in the 19th century that show all these categories that are constructed. And then if you want to dig a little bit deeper, show some of the court documents where people are arguing why they should be categorized according to a different casta, category or casta mix, because the mixes proliferate, because people doing what people do, they marry and have relationships across these casta lines. And the utter chaos of this sort of obsession with policing race and ethnicity, it just falls apart. It absolutely falls apart. And I just find it utterly fascinating that only recently has the sort of the Afro-Mexicano history been sort of a thing, because you don't have to do too much digging to know that some of the first conquests, there were Black conquistadors. Juan Garrido is an example of one of them. But then very quickly there are, casta categories that have, people of African descent. So I don't know. It's just it's for my students. It's a real eye opener for me to say, this all is socially constructed, and you get some eye rolls. But then you show them this stuff, and the eye rolling stops, and they're just utterly slack jawed, to try and figure out wow, okay, so let's compare this now to the United States experience, right? But there is elements of blood quantum that are, carried across the Atlantic by the Spanish. Of course, it's couched in a religious kind of language, and they're speaking initially about Jews and Muslims, but they transport that thinking very quickly, and it transforms and adapts, and it's an utterly fascinating topic. So I think that we're just now scratching the surface on this as historians. So I try to integrate as much of that into my class as possible.
I was actually doing some reading about the caste system and how over just like the years and years and years, it just broke down to colorism, because it was basically like you either were lighter or darker because everybody was so intermixed. And it's funny how that really perpetuated and propagated, and how colorism runs rampant in Black communities, in Indigenous communities, Afro-Indigenous communities. It's something that, once again, is a byproduct of colonization. And you can see those effects happening today. So when people talk about the history of things as if it happened, a long time ago, it's happening today. It still is happening. We are living with the consequences of that. But we're coming to the end. We only have 3 minutes left. So I want to give y'all the opportunity, if you're working on a project or you want people to come see you, or what happens, to just give yourselves a big old plug. Plug.
Well, I'd like to invite anybody who's listening. You can come to our website, uaine.org, and we have information there about how to join our Facebook group, where we have daily postings with lots of news and events, and information about National Day of Mourning, and the link for the live stream for National Day of Mourning this year, all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I have my Iberian Empires class again in the spring, which again, where we examine some of the origins of some of this sort of blood quantum thinking that again will, like you said, resurface and lives on today, and sort of the language of you mentioned sort of colorism, but the term pigmentocracy is often used to sort of describe this sort of phenotypical, sort of assessment of ethnicity and race. Just the normal course rotation, and I'm sort of in the weeds right now with a couple of early projects. So
I'm writing pigmentocracy down.
And that's a great way of putting it.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, phenotype is important, but there's a lot of passing. You can, if you bribe the right priest at one of those key moments in your life, you can pass into another casta. If you dress up for to impress sort of European eyes, like Benito Juarez did famously. I mean, he could have dressed as a Zapotec, but he chose to sort of pass as kind of a mestizo. It's really fluid, and the borders are fuzzy in the casta system, and it's really complex and interesting for that reason.
For me, I as Indigenous folks, we try not to get up there and brag about what we're, because that's for other people to do. What I will say though, is that all folks come from Indigenous heritage. You just have to go back far enough to see. And once I tell students, especially if they're in Oklahoma, we typically have that Scottish or Irish mix. And I'm like, you don't have to go back very far to really understand how this works. Your folks came over as colonizers, but previous to that, they were being colonized in Ireland and Scotland. And you can go back further than that. And so if we start couching this and explaining this, that colonization is a never-ending process, it really changes their perspective a little bit. So I'll just end with that one.
Okay. And I wanted to ask one more question, just one more sincere question for those inspired by this conversation to really rethink what Thanksgiving is, and they want to replace that. What should people do in their own homes? Because of course, all of this change is going to start right at their own home.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. We actually address this directly at our website and in our Facebook group and at the event, which is we have some suggestions for what people can do to honor National Day of Mourning if they can't come to Plymouth. And we invite people to take a look at that. If you go to uaine.org, you will see that. And there's lots of good things you can do. You can choose to give some money to Indigenous-led grassroots organizations, for starters. That would be a great thing to do if you're able to donate. You can try to think about where you're living and whose land you're on as a starter, because a lot of non-native people don't do that. You can read the history of what actually happened in Plymouth. You can commit to learning more about Indigenous nations in your area, and also commit to getting a better understanding of Indigenous history overall in the country and in the continent, for that matter. There's a lot of different things that people can do. So we do suggest that if you're sitting around a dinner table, you can just say, you know what, we all grew up with all of these ideas about Thanksgiving, and I have learned this new information, and I want to tell you about this new information that I've learned about how some Indigenous people feel about it and what the Indigenous history is of Thanksgiving, and share that with your family or whoever you're sitting down with too.
In our family, we just don't celebrate Thanksgiving. We do it every day when we go out and say a prayer in the morning, offer our tobacco. We just try to be grateful as we always are every day. So the idea of like perpetuating another American myth we're just not having it. So we don't do that in our family. We try to give every day. And I think that would be the best thing that I could say to start with, is just recognizing that that's not how we celebrate or how we want to offer our thankfulness. Just do it every day instead of like taking the American myth.
Heard it here, folks. Not asking you to do anything. We're just asking you not to. All right. Just to not. All right. And with that, we're going to close. I'm going to read our closing statement. Thank you so much, Dr. Patrick. Thank you so much, Dr. Nikki, Matoli. This was really an enlightening conversation. I am inspired by your words, your struggle, and your eloquence, and hope to do something like this once again in the future.
Thank you for having us, Wanishi.
Very much.
Good.
Nice to meet you all. Thank you.
All right. All right. In this conversation, and also our appreciation to the folks that make Real Talk possible: Tri-City Collective, the Woody Guthrie Center, Folk Art Alliance International, Tulsa Artist Fellowship, and the Black Wall Street Times. And thank you to all that joined us live today. Join us again next month. Real Talk is live every third Saturday. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.